Under the relentless sun of West Texas, Amos Brennan rode with a measured gait, his horse kicking up clouds of dust with each deliberate step. He'd been tracking a stray calf for hours, the hoofprints faint in the parched earth, leading him deeper into the scrubland where mesquite and cactus stood like sentinels of a forgotten world. The silence was profound, broken only by the creak of his saddle, the low moan of wind through dry grass, and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk. Amos preferred it this way, solitary, quiet, predictable. At 56, he'd seen enough of men and their noise to know the desert's hush was a better companion. But then he heard a sound so faint it could have been the wind playing tricks, a stifled gasp, like someone fighting for air they couldn't find. Amos reined in his horse, his weathered hand tightening on the leather. His heart slowed, ears straining. There it was again, sharper now, a weak cry that sliced through the stillness like a blade. He swung down from the saddle, tying the reins to a gnarled juniper, and slung his rifle over his shoulder. Moving swiftly but silently, he navigated the rocky terrain, his boots crunching softly on gravel until he reached a clearing fringed by ancient pecans. There, beneath the largest tree, he saw her, a young woman, no older than 20, hung by her wrists from a low branch. Her arms were stretched taut, her body sagging like a marionette with cut strings. Her feet grazed the dirt, barely supporting her weight. Her skin was sun-bronzed, caked with dust, her long dark hair tangled with sweat and blood. Her chest heaved in shallow, uneven breath. She was alive, but only just. Amos's gaze snapped to a rough wooden sign nailed above her head. The words, scrawled in crude black paint, burned into his mind. "White man never forgets." He staggered back, a sour taste rising in his throat. The air felt heavy, charged with malice, as if the sign itself were a curse etched into the world. His eyes darted across the clearing, scanning the ridges and boulders for movement. Nothing. Just the wind stirring dead leaves, whispering secrets he didn't want to hear. His hand found the knife at his belt. "God Almighty," he muttered, voice rough as gravel. "What in hell did they do to you?" The girl stirred, her head lolling forward. Amos saw the raw welts where the rope bit into her wrists, red and angry against her skin. "You hear me?" he called, his voice low but firm. No answer. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said, softer now, almost to himself. He stepped closer, boots crunching on the dry earth. Her face came into view, young, maybe 18, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. Her cheeks sunken from dehydration. Dried blood crusted her lower lip. He reached for the rope, his fingers brushing the coarse hemp. It was old, prickly, designed to tear skin with every twist. Whoever had tied her meant for her to suffer, not just die. The sign loomed above, its words screaming accusations Amos hadn't earned, but felt all the same. He hesitated, the weight of it pressing on him. But then she whimpered again, a sound so raw it broke something inside him. "Damn them all," he whispered, sliding his knife under the rope. "I ain't that man." With a single, sure cut, the rope snapped. She collapsed forward, and Amos caught her, her weight surprisingly light, as if pain had hollowed her out. Her body was fever-hot, trembling in his arms. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and unfocused, filled with fear that didn't know where to land. Amos eased her to the ground, kneeling in the dust. He pulled his canteen from his belt, soaked a bandana, and pressed it to her cracked lips. "Easy now," he said, voice steady. "You're safe. For now." She blinked, slow and deliberate, her hand twitching toward his sleeve, clutching weakly. Amos glanced at the sign one last time, then at her. He shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, the fabric swallowing her small frame. "You got a name?" he asked gently. No response. "Guess we'll find one for you," he murmured. He stood, lifting her with effort, cradling her like something precious and fragile. "But for now, you're with me." Amos carried her back to his horse, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the desert. His ranch lay a few miles off a modest spread clinging to the edge of a land too harsh to forgive mistakes. A lone windmill groaned on the property line, and the barn leaned like it carried the weight of old sorrows. The house was simple, one room with a loft, a tin roof patched with care, solid and unyielding like the man who'd built it. He eased the girl down from the saddle and carried her inside. her fevered head resting against his chest, her breath shallow and uneven. He laid her on the cot near the window, peeling back the jacket with care. Her eyes flickered open briefly, wide and wary, but they held his gaze, searching. Amos lit a lantern, its glow dancing across the rough-hewn walls, and filled a tin basin with water. He grabbed a clean cloth and knelt beside her. Her legs were bruised, scraped raw, one ankle swollen. Rope burns circled her wrists like cruel bracelets. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, more to fill the silence than expecting a reply. "Just cleaning you up." He dipped the cloth in warm water, wrung it out, and gently took her right foot, placing it in the basin. She flinched, a barely perceptible twitch. Amos paused, waiting. When she didn't pull away, he began washing the dust and blood from her skin, his touch deliberate, almost reverent, as if he were handling something holy. The water clouded with red and brown. He worked in silence, feeling her gaze on him, sharp and uncertain, like a blade half-drawn. Her lips parted once, but no sound came. "Reckon you don't talk much," he said, not unkindly. "That's fine. Silence beats most things out here." He finished one foot, then the other, wrapping them in soft cloth strips and setting them on a folded blanket. "You remind me of a creek I used to fish at," he said, voice low, almost to himself. "Dry most of the year, looked dead to most folks. But when the rains came, it roared deep and fierce. Locals called it Silent Fang. Never knew why. Just quiet, mostly." He studied her in the lamplight, sharp cheekbones, full lips cracked from thirst, dark lashes heavy with sand. She was young, too young for this kind of pain, but her eyes held something ancient, something that didn't cower from suffering, only endured it. "I'll call you Mara," he said softly. "Just for now. You look like a Marraquite, but strong." She blinked, slow and heavy, no protest, no agreement. Just breath. Amos stood, hands damp, and tucked a blanket around her shoulders. "If you're hungry, there's stew. Not much, but it's better than nothing." Still no answer. He dragged his bedroll toward the door, intending to sleep in the barn. She didn't need a stranger looming over her, especially not one with his own ghosts and unanswered questions. Before stepping outside, he glanced back. She'd shifted slightly, eyes closed, lips still. The basin sat beside the cot, tinged with the blood and dirt of her ordeal. Amos carried it outside, pouring the water into the thirsty earth, watching it vanish. Inside, Mara dreamed of fire, of ropes cutting the sky, of hands both rough and gentle washing away pain, without demanding anything in return. The days that followed settled into a cautious rhythm, the desert's pulse slow but unyielding. Mara ate sparingly when Amos brought food, her movements guarded, eyes always scanning, body coiled like a spring. She never spoke, but Amos caught her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. At night, he left her the cot and slept in the barn, his rifle close, claiming it was to give her space. But the truth was heavier. That sign-white man never forgets haunted him, its words a warning, a threat, a mirror he didn't want to face. Whoever had hung her might come looking, and Amos wasn't sure what scared him more, their rival or what their presence would force him to confront. 3 mornings later, he found the footprint, smaller than his, fresh, pressed into the hardpan near the barn. He crouched, studying the heel military issue, cavalry, no more than a few hours old. His eyes flicked to the horizon, where sagebrush shimmered in the heat. Nothing. Inside, Mara sat by the window, still as stone, blanket pulled tight. She didn't look at him when he entered, but her shoulders tensed. "Seen anyone?" he asked. Silence. "Think we've got company," he murmured, more to himself. That evening, he dimmed the lantern and sat on the porch, rifle across his knees. The wind had stilled, coyotes yowling in the distance, stars piercing the black sky. Mara didn't sleep, heard her pacing inside, slow and deliberate, like a caged animal testing its bars. By midday, a rider appeared, dust trailing behind a bay horse. The man wore the blue and gold of the U.S. Cavalry, his rifle holstered, hat tilted low, face rough with stubble. Amos stepped off the porch, hand resting lightly on his belt. The soldier reined in, squinting. "You Amos Brennan?" "Depends who's asking," Amos replied, voice even. Captain Ellis, Fort Stockton. Tracking a fugitive, the man pulled a folded notice from his pocket and handed it down. Seen her. Amos unfolded the paper, already knowing what he'd find. A rough sketch of a young woman, sharp eyes, long hair, unmistakably Mara. The text read, "Wanted for theft and murder. Dangerous. Reward $500. He looked up, face unreadable. "Can't say I have." "You sure?" Ellis leaned forward, voice hard. "Young, quiet, likely hurt. Might be hiding. We think someone took her near Pecan Hollow." Amos held the paper a moment longer, then folded it and handed it back. "Ain't seen nobody but lizards and a steer to dumb to graze." Ellis's eyes narrowed. "She's no innocent, Brennan. Part of a band of thieves-killers. That sign they left. They mean it." Amos's jaw tightened. "If I see anything, I'll send word." The soldier studied him, then nodded curtly and turned his horse. "See that you do." Amos watched until the dust settled, then stepped inside. Mara stood just beyond the curtain, her eyes locked on him. She'd heard every word. "They came looking," he said, setting his head on the table. "Showed me a paper. Said you're wanted." She didn't speak, her gaze wary, searching. "I told them no." Her eyes narrowed, confusion and suspicion flickering. Amos turned to the stove, stirring a pot of beans already done. "I don't know what you did, Mara, and maybe you'll tell me someday. But out here, a man chooses his path. I chose mine." Behind him, she shifted, a small breath escaping. In that moment, trust cracked the silence, just enough to let something new take root. The afternoon sun hung low, shadows stretching across the yard. Amos sat on the porch, sharpening his knife with slow, rhythmic strokes. Each scrape of steel on stone a tether to his thoughts. He tried not to dwell on the woman inside, on whether she slept or stared at the walls. But her presence was a weight he couldn't shake. A faint crunch of gravel broke his focus. Not a coyote, not a horse-a-mething human. He set the knife down, eyes scanning the yard. Mara was outside. It was the first time she'd left the house on her own since he'd brought her here. She moved tentatively, barefoot, the blanket he'd left on her cot draped over her shoulders. Her steps were uneven but deliberate, leading her to a bare patch of dirt near the barn, swept clean by the wind. Amos watched, unmoving, afraid to break the moment. She looked smaller in the open, more fragile, yet there was a quiet strength in her gait. She wasn't fleeing, she was claiming something. Kneeling carefully, she let the blanket slip to her elbows and picked up a stick, drawing in the dust. Only then did Amos rise, approaching slowly, boots soft on the earth. He stopped a few feet behind her, watching her hand carve lines into the ground. She'd drawn a deer, antlers branching wide, mid-leap, but flames curled around its legs, licking upward like a trap. The lines were bold, etched with a tension that made the image feel alive. Caught between flight and destruction. Amos had seen symbols before in saddles, on graves, but this was something deeper. A story told in dirt. "What's that?" he asked, voice low, respectful. Mara didn't look up, her face still, eyes fixed on the drawing. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice dry and cracked like a stream in drought. "Deer and fire. My people's sign." Amos stayed quiet, his gaze on the image. She tapped the deer's heart with the stick. "This was my father's. Our family. We carved it on wagons, wove it into blankets. Always running, always fire." He felt the weight in her words, the way her shoulders stiffened, her jaw tight. She was bracing for judgment. "Soldiers came last fall," she continued, voice halting. "Said we had to Levigo to a place with no water, no game. We said no. We stayed. We fought." Her voice thinned, the stick trembling in her hand. "They burned our camp, killed my mother, my brother, burned the elders in their sleep." Amos's fists clenched, an old anger stirring. "I ran, hid. They found me, beat me, tied me, called me a thief, said I stole a horse. I didn't." She turned, locking eyes with him, fury blazing in her voice. "I didn't steal. I didn't kill. I did nothing wrong." Her words rang out, raw and unyielding, like a storm breaking. Amos held her gaze, his voice low but certain. "I believe you." She dropped the stick, her hands falling to her lap. Her shoulders shook, silent at first, then the sobs came, jagged and unrestrained. She curled forward, hair veiling her face, grief too vast for her frame. Amos stayed beside her, unmoving, not offering empty comfort. Instead, he pressed his hand into the dirt beside the burning deer, palm flat. Fingers spread a silent vow, a witness to her pain. Her breathing slowed. She lifted her head, face streaked with tears and dust. Their eyes met, unguarded. "You can call me Mara," she whispered. Amos nodded, voice rough. "All right, Mara. That's who you are." They sat in silence as the sun sank, the fire in the dirt fading to shadow. But its truth, like her story, lingered, unburned and undeniable. That night, the wind hummed through the eaves, soft and restless. Amos sat by the fire, sleeves rolled, stirring a pot of beans. Mara stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the night settle over the desert. The silence between them was no longer a barrier but a bridge, fragile but real. She turned abruptly. "You want the truth?" Amos looked up, spoon pausing. He nodded, careful not to push. She crossed to the table, sitting across from him, her voice steady but quiet. "My father was a small leader. Our band was peaceful. We traded with ranchers, learned their ways, their prayers. We wanted to live." Amos listened, his face still but attentive. "Last winter," she continued, "a settler's wife was found dead near our camp, throat slashed. Her husband blamed us, but he did it. Everyone knew. Still, they came soldiers, ranchers, men with guns and hate. They called it justice." Her fingers gripped the table's edge, knuckles pale. "They burned our tents, shot my brother as he slept. My mother died clutching a cross the preacher gave her. They hung my father from a post." Amos's eyes dropped, his jaw tight. "I hid in a ditch. They found me, took my knife, said I planned to kill. They beat me, tied me, left me on that tree as a warning." She stared at him, voice soft but piercing. "Why did you cut me down?" Amos met her gaze, the fire's glow flickering between them. "Because once," he said, voice low, "I didn't act. Last year, raiders hit my spread. Maybe your people, maybe not. I was out checking fences. Came back to smoke and ruin. My daughter, Ellie, was 17. I heard her screaming in the shed. I was scared to move. I waited for help. She was gone before it came. The silence that followed was heavy, not empty. You saved me because you couldn't save her, Mara said, barely a whisper. He nodded. She studied him, eyes searching. If I'd been someone else, would you still have cut the rope? Amos stood, slow and deliberate, and moved to her side. He knelt, cupping her chin gently, his calloused fingers soft against her skin. I don't see skin, he said, voice steady. I see what's alive beneath it. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She pressed her cheek into his hand, and then, as if drawn by a tide, they leaned into each other. The kiss was tentative, then deep, a release of held breath, of shared wounds. Her hands rested on his chest, trembling. His arms encircled her, steady and sure. The fire crackled softly, a quiet witness. Later, they stood in the small kitchen, candlelight casting their shadows as one on the wall, a slow, unspoken dance. Outside, the wind stilled, and inside, something broken began to heal. The morning wind returned with a vengeance, gusting across the West Texas scrubland, carrying the faint scent of smoke and unrest. Amos Brennan felt it deep in his bonus, a shift in the air, like the prelude to a storm that brought trouble instead of rain. At 56, he'd learned to trust the desert's warnings, and today they were louder than usual. 3 days had passed since the kiss, since the unspoken bond between him and Mara had taken root in the quiet of his small ranch house. The memory of her lips, hesitant then sure, lingered like a warmth he hadn't known he could still feel. Mara had begun to move with more ease around the ranch. She fed the chickens, her hands steady as she scattered grain, and swept the porch with a broom that seemed too large for her frame. Once when Amos cursed at a mule that kicked over a water bucket, she'd laughed a soft, fleeting sound that caught him off guard and made the world feel briefly less heavy. But the peace was fragile, a thin veneer over a truth neither of them could ignore. The world beyond the ranch was closing in. By noon, a dust trail rose from the east, snaking across the horizon. Amos stood by the fence line, his jaw tight, rifle leaning against the porch rail. 3 riders approached, their silhouettes sharp against the glaring sun. They weren't soldiers, but localsmen in weathered canvas coats and wide-brimmed hats, rifles slung across their backs. The leader, a weary man with a tin badge pinned to his chest, dismounted with a swagger that suggested authority he hadn't earned. Amos recognized him, Silas Reed, a rancher turned self-styled lawman, known for settling disputes with a quick trigger. "Brennan," Silas called, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "Heard you might be keeping company that don't belong here." Amos kept his voice steady, his hand resting casually on his belt. "You hear a lot of things, Silas. Doesn't make 'em true." Silas's eyes narrowed, his two companions shifting in their saddles, hands hovering near their holsters. "A girl," Silas said, "one of them troublemakers from the camps. There's a reward $500 and the gratitude of every honest man this side of the Rio Grande. You hiding her?" Amos stepped down from the porch, his boots deliberate on the gravel. "You got a warrant, Reed?" Silas snorted, a harsh sound that grated against the stillness. "This ain't a courtroom, Brennan. We're here to check your place, make sure you ain't harboring a fugitive." The air turned brittle, the tension thick enough to choke on. Amos's gaze flicked to the men behind Silas, their faces hard and unyielding. "I'm the only one lives here," he said, voice calm but edged with steel. "Just me, some goats, and a few ghosts." Silas stared, his lips curling into a sneer. After a long moment, he nodded curtly. "If you're lying, Brennan, you'll answer for it. And it won't be pretty." He mounted his horse, the others following, and they rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a promise of return. Amos watched until they vanished, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. He turned back to the house where Mara stood just inside the doorway, her eyes wide, the blanket clutched tight around her shoulders. She'd heard every word, seen every glance. "They'll come back," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Amos nodded, setting his hat on the table. "They will, with more men and less talk." That night, he sat by the fire pit behind the barn, the stars obscured by heavy clouds. In his hands was the wooden sign he'd buried after cutting Mara down. "White man never forgets." He'd dug it up that morning, unable to leave it in the earth like some forgotten sin. The paint was faded, but the words still burned, sharp and hateful. He traced the letters with his thumb, each one a weight, a question, a judgment. The crunch of footsteps broke his thoughts. Mara appeared, wearing one of his old coats, the sleeves rolled up, her hair loose and catching the firelight. She stepped beside him, her eyes on the flames, not the sign. Her presence was enough, a silent understanding that didn't need words. Amos stared at the sign one last time, then stood and placed it on the kindling. He struck a match, and the flames rose, slow at first, then fierce, consuming the wood in a blaze of orange and gold. The letters curled and blackened, the hate within them resisting, but ultimately yielding to the fire. "I should have burned it sooner," Amos said, his voice barely audible over the crackle. Mara didn't reply, but she moved closer, her shoulder brushing his. Her fingers gripped the coat, knuckles pale. "Thank you," she said, the words soft but heavy, like a prayer offered to the night. He looked at her, his heart caught between grief and something alive, something new. The fire burned low, embers glowing like stars fallen to earth. Above, the clouds parted, revealing a sliver of moonlight. For the first time since he'd found her, the weight of that sign was gone, replaced by heat, smoke, and the choice they'd made to stand together. The next morning brought no wind, just a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the desert were holding its breath. Amos rose early, packing a saddlebag with biscuits, jerky, and a canteen. The air around the ranch was taut, watched. He'd seen smoke on the horizon the night before, too steady for a campfire, too close for comfort. Word had spread, and time was running out. Mara stood by the fence, her hair braided tightly, the coat draped over her shoulders. Her face was calm, but her eyes held questions she didn't voice. "We have to go," Amos said, securing the saddlebag. "Tonight." She nodded, already knowing. "There's land south," he continued, his voice low. "Beyond the border, in the Sierra Madres. Some say folks live free there, far from soldiers, far from signs. We can make it if we move fast." Mara stepped closer, her eyes searching his. She reached for his hand, her grip firm. "You'll come with me?" Amos's throat tightened. He looked down at her, the weight of her question heavier than any promise. "Mara," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "I ain't letting you go alone." She pressed her forehead to his chest, her breath warm against his shirt. Then, in a voice slow and careful, she said, "I want to live. I want to live as your wife." Amos closed his eyes, her words sinking into him like rain into parched earth. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, grounding himself in her presence. "Then that's what we'll do," he said, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. By sundown, they were ready. 2 horses saddled, the ranch left behind no note, no fire. Just a door left ajar and a home turned to memory. They rode under a canopy of stars, the moonlight painting the desert silver. Mara leaned forward on her horse, her movements fluid, practiced, as if the saddle were an extension of her. She didn't ask what lay ahead, only followed, her trust in Amos a quiet force. 10 miles from the border, the terrain opened into low scrub and jagged cliffs. Amos scanned the horizon, his gut tight, every shadow a potential threat. Then it came a sharp crack, a rifle shot echoing across the plain. Amos jerked in the saddle, pain searing through his side. He slid to the ground, clutching his ribs, blood soaking his shirt. "Amos," Mara screamed, leaping from her horse. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed them to his wound. "Keep going," he rasped, his voice wet with pain. "No," she said, fierce and unyielding. Another shot whizzed past, striking the rock behind them. From the ridge, 2 figures emerged, riders, rifles raised, their silhouettes dark against the moon. Amos groaned, forcing himself up. "We have to move." Mara hooked her arm under his shoulder, half lifting him. "Believe me," she growled, "I won't let you die." Through sheer will, they stumbled toward a cluster of rocks, bullets cutting through the night. Amos's boots dragged, each step a battle, his vision blurring. They reached a narrow pass between 2 cliffs, a hidden gap in the stone. Mara half dragged him inside, pressing him against the wall, her chest heaving. The shots fatted riders wouldn't follow through the rocks, not without risking their speed or their lives. In the shadow of the pass, Amos collapsed to his knees, blood pooling in the dust. He looked up at Mara, pain and wonder in his eyes. "You said you wanted to be my wife." She knelt, cupping his face, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I meant it." His lips curved, a faint smile through the pain. "Then we better make it through this pass." She nodded, and for the first time, Mara prayed not to the gods of settlers, but to the spirits of wind, stone, and survival. Love in this desert was a gamble, and tonight, they were staking everything on it. The weeks that followed were a blur of fever and flight. They found shelter in a shallow cave, hidden by mesquite and guarded by cliffs. Mara tended Amos's wound, cleaning it with water from a nearby spring, binding it with strips of her own shirt. The bullet had missed vital organs, but infection loomed, and Amos drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting to hold on. Mara barely slept, her eyes scanning the horizon for riders, her hands never far from the knife Amos had given her. One night, as the fever peaked, Amos woke, his eyes clear for the first time in days. Mara sat beside him, a damp cloth on his brow, her face etched with exhaustion. He reached for her hand, his grip weak but firm. "You're still here," he murmured. "Where else would I be?" she said, her voice soft but fierce. He smiled, wincing as he shifted. "Tell me something true, Mara. Something real." She hesitated, then guided his hand to her chest, over her heart. "My name," she said, "is Talia. It means morning light. My father chose it, said I was born at dawn." Amos closed his eyes, letting the name settle into him like a vow. "Talia," he repeated, the word a bomb. "You're the only light I've known in a long time." She didn't cry, only held his hand tighter, her strength anchoring them both. The fever broke the next day, and with it, a fragile hope took root. They couldn't stay in the Cavith riders would come, or the desert would claim them. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. As Amos grew stronger, they planned their next move. The Sierra Madres lay south, a promise of freedom, but the journey was treacherous, and the border was watched. Talia spoke of her people, of stories her father told of hidden trails and safe havens. Amos listened, his trust in her growing with every word. They were no longer just survivors, they were partners. bound by something deeper than fear or necessity. One evening, as they sat by a small fire, Talia traced the scar on Amos's side, her fingers gentle. "You could have left me," she said, her voice quiet. "Back at the tree, or when they shot you. Why didn't you?" Amos looked into the flames, his face unreadable. "Because I've lost too much to let go of what's good." "You're good, Talia. You're worth fighting for." She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, and for a moment, the world was just the two of them, the fire, and the promise of a life they might yet claim. The desert stretched endless under a sky bruised with dawn, the air sharp with the promise of heat. Amos Brennan and Talia had left the cave behind, moving south through hidden trails only Talia's memory could navigate. Amos's wound had healed enough to ride, though each jolt of the horse sent a dull ache through his side. At 56, he'd known pain before, but this was different, sharpened by purpose, softened by the woman riding beside him. Talia's eyes scanned the horizon, her braids swinging with the rhythm of her horse, her face set with a quiet determination that made Amos's heart ache with pride. They'd been traveling for weeks, skirting settlements and soldier patrols, living off jerky, wild roots, and water from springs Talia seemed to find by instinct. The Sierra Madres loomed closer, their peaks a jagged promise against the sky. But the desert was unforgiving, and the men hunting them were relentless. Amos felt it in the air, a tightening, like the moment before a rattler strikes. They were running out of time. One evening, they made camp in a shallow canyon, the walls glowing red in the fading light. Talia built a small fire, her hands quick and sure, while Amos checked the horses. As he tethered them, he caught her watching him, her eyes soft but heavy with unspoken thoughts. "What is it?" he asked, brushing dust from his hands. She poked at the fire, sending sparks skyward. "You're still here," she said, her voice low. "After the tree, the bullets, the fever, most men would have turned back." Amos sat across from her, the fire's glow etching lines on his weathered face. "Most men don't know what they're fighting for." "I do." Her lips curved, a faint smile that held more weight than words. She reached across the fire, her hand finding his, their fingers entwining. "When we reach the Sierra," she said, "what will we be?" Amos's throat tightened. He squeezed her hand, his voice steady. "Husband and wife, Talia, if you'll still have me." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "I will," she said, and the words were a vow, sealed in the desert's quiet. They slept close that night, her back pressed to his chest, his arm around her. The stars above were sharp, unyielding, but for the first time in years, Amos felt anchored, not adrift. The desert could take everything else, but it couldn't take this. Dawn brought trouble. As they broke camp, Amos spotted dust on the horizon, riders, moving fast. He cursed under his breath, grabbing the rifle. "Talia, we need to move." She was already saddling the horses, her movements swift but calm. "How many?" she asked. "4, maybe 5, he said, squinting against the rising sun. "They're not soldiers. Locals, likely Silas Reed's men." Talia's jaw tightened, but she nodded. They mounted and rode hard, the canyon narrowing into a maze of stone and scrub. The hoof beats behind them grew louder, relentless. Amos's wound throbbed, but he pushed through, his focus on Talia, on the promise they'd made. They couldn't outrun the riders forever. The horses were tiring, and the terrain was treacherous. At a fork in the trail, Talia reined in, her eyes scanning the rocks. "There," she said, pointing to a narrow pass hidden by boulders. "It's tight, but it'll slow them down." Amos nodded, trusting her instincts. They urged the horses through, the walls closing in, scraping their legs. Behind, shouts echoed. Silas's men had spotted them. A shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off stone. Amos ducked, his heart pounding. "Keep low," he called. Talia pressed forward, her horse sure-footed despite the chaos. The pass opened into a wide basin, ringed by cliffs. It was a dead end, a trap. Amos swore, pulling his rifle. "We'll have to make a stand." Talia dismounted, grabbing the knife from her belt. "Not without me," she said, her voice fierce. They took cover behind a boulder, Amos sighting down the rifle. Talia crouched beside him, her eyes scanning for movement. The riders appeared at the mouth of the pass, 5 of them, led by Silas Reed. His badge glinted in the sun, his face twisted with a mix of triumph and hate. "Brennan," he shouted, "hand over the girl, and we'll let you walk away." Amos's voice was cold, steady. "You're on my land, Reed. Turn back, or you won't leave it." Silas laughed, a harsh bark. "You're outnumbered, old man. She's a thief, a killer. There's a price on her head, and we aim to collect." Talia's hand tightened on her knife, her eyes blazing. "I'm no thief," she called, her voice ringing across the basin. "You know it, Reed. You know what your people did to mine." Silas's smile faded, his hand twitching toward his gun. "You talk too much for a dead girl." Amos fired, the shot grazing Silas's shoulder. The man yelped, and chaos erupted. The riders scattered, returning fire, bullets kicking up dust around the boulder. Amos reloaded, his movements precise despite the pain in his side. Talia stayed low, her knife ready, her eyes locked on the riders' positions. One man broke from cover, charging their position. Talia sprang up, her knife flashing, catching him in the arm. He screamed, dropping his pistol, and Amos finished him with a shot to the leg. "Stay down," Amos roared, his voice carrying over the gunfire. Silas's men faltered, their numbers dwindling. Two retreated, dragging their wounded, but Silas pressed forward, his face a mask of rage. "You're a fool, Brennan," he shouted. "She'll bring you nothing but death." Amos aimed, his finger steady on the trigger. "She's brought me more than you'll ever know." He fired, and Silas fell, clutching his chest, his badge glinting one last time before he hit the dirt. The remaining riders fled, their hoof beats fading into the distance. Amos lowered his rifle, his breath ragged. Talia stood, her knife still in hand, her face streaked with dust and resolve. They checked that Basincilas was dead, his men gone or incapacitated. The fight was over, but the cost was heavy. Amos's wound had reopened, blood seeping through his shirt. Talia knelt beside him, tearing a strip from her shirt to bind the wound. "You're too stubborn to die," she said, her voice trembling but firm. He managed a weak smile. "Got too much to live for now." They rested in the basin, tending their wounds, salvaging what they could from the riders' gear. The horses were exhausted, but they had to keep moving. The Sierra Madres were close, and with Silas gone, the pursuit might falter. But Amos knew better than to trust the desert's mercy. They reached the border 2 days later, crossing under a moonless sky. The land opened into rolling hills, dotted with pine and mesquite, the air cooler, softer. Talia led them to a hidden valley, a place her father had spoken of, where a small band of her people lived, free from soldiers and signs. The camp was Humbleton's and lodges scattered along a river, surrounded by reeds and wildflowers. An elder greeted them, a woman with silver hair and eyes that saw too much. She listened to Talia's story, her gaze flickering to Amos, measuring. "You bring a stranger," she said, her voice like dry leaves. "He's no stranger," Talia replied, her hand finding Amos's. "He's my husband." The elder studied them, then nodded. "The river welcomes those who carry truth." They were given a lodge by the water, simple but sturdy, made of pine and hide. Amos's strength returned slowly, his wound healing under Talia's care and the elder's herbs. Talia, too, began to heal not just from the ropes and the beatings, but from the deeper scars of loss and betrayal. She moved through the camp with purpose, helping with chores, sharing stories of her father, her voice growing stronger each day. One evening, as they sat by the river, Talia stitched a small blanket, her fingers deft with the needle. Her belly had begun to round, a gentle curve visible beneath her woven sash. She hummed softly, a tune Amos didn't know but felt in his bones. He watched her from the lodge's doorway, his heart full in a way he'd never thought possible. She looked up, catching his gaze, and smiled. "What are you staring at, old man?" "You," he said simply, crossing to her. He knelt, placing a hand on her belly. "And our future." Talia laid her hand over his, her eyes bright. "This little one," she said, "will know a world without signs, without hate. We'll make sure of it." Amos nodded, his throat tight. "We will." Months passed, the seasons turning soft in the valley. Their lodge grew into a home, filled with the scent of herbs, the weight of 2 books, and a child's blanket, now finished. Talia, now Talia Brennan, was the heart of it. her presence a quiet strength that grounded everything. Amos worked the land, trading with the camp, his hands calloused but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. One dusk, Talia walked to the river, barefoot, the water cool against her skin. She placed both hands on her belly, her voice a whisper. "Little one, your father didn't just save me. He loved me, and he kept his promise. We're home." Amos joined her, his steps soft on the grass, their fingers lacing together without a word. They watched the river flow, stars blinking into view, the world quiet and whole. No one had expected two broken souls to find this a patch of earth where love had taken root. Not the kind of legend, but the kind that endured. Their daughter was born in spring, under a sky streaked with dawn. They named her Leela, meaning hope, a name that carried the weight of their journey and the promise of what lay ahead. Lila's cries were strong, her eyes bright like her mother's, and Amos held her with a reverence that made Talia's heart ache. The camp celebrated, the elder blessing the child with words of river and light. Years later, the valley remained their sanctuary. Leela grew, running through the reeds, her laughter a song that echoed across the water. Amos and Talia grew older, their hair graying, their hands worn, but their love was a constant, unyielding as the river. The world beyond the valley still turned, with its violence and injustice, but here, they'd built something stronger, a life where mercy had won, where love had rewritten the story. As the sun set one evening, Amos and Talia sat by the lodge, Leela asleep inside, her blanket tucked around her. Talia leaned against Amos, her head on his shoulder. "We made it," she said, her voice soft but sure. "We did," Amos replied, kissing her forehead, "and we'll keep making it every day." The river flowed on, peaceful, like Talia's name, like their life, like a home that had finally taken root in a world of scars. We hope this story stirred your heart, showing that even in the harshest landscapes, love and mercy can bloom where hate once stood. Share your thoughts in the comments below, especially on the themes of violence and injustice that shaped Amos and Talia's journey. Do you believe mercy can overcome hate, or does violence leave scars too deep to heal? Take a stand, share your perspective, and let's start a conversation that keeps this story alive.